Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the December installment of ILA's Leadership Perspectives webinar series. My name is Ashley Woolen. I'm a program manager at the International Leadership Association. I will be moderating this webinar with Jane Jordan-Meier. Before we begin, please note the following. First, this webinar will be archived. If you missed something, would like to hear this webinar again, or would like to see the presentation again, they will be published to the ILA website within 24 hours. You will receive an email with instructions for accessing the archived recording after the webinar has ended. Second, we welcome your questions throughout the webinar. At any time, you may ask questions by typing them into the questions box of your webinar control panel, which is currently displayed on the right-hand side of your screen. We will address your questions during the second half of the webinar. Please note, however, that due to time, we may not be able to address each question we receive. Third, several of today's participants will win a copy of the book on which this webinar is based, The 4 Stages of Highly Effective Crisis Management. I will announce these winners at the end of our session today. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Recognized as one of the world's top media and crisis management experts, Jane Jordan-Meier works at the highest level of strategic planning and communications, including projects for the Australian Bicentennial celebrations and the Sydney Olympic Games. Her clients include experienced CEOs of global corporations, and many of her training programs have won awards from her peers in the public relations and communication professions. Formerly a journalist, Jane has more than 25 years of experience in media and communication management. For the last 15 years, she has been at the forefront of media training, developing unique and powerful methodologies in crisis media management. Jane, thank you so much for your time today and welcome.
Thank you, Ashley, and hello, everybody. Hello, Asia. A big hello to all my colleagues or friends and fellow Australians down under. Hello, Europe, and hello, North America. And I understand this is the last webinar for this year. So before I forget, let me wish you all a very Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Season's Greeting, and the best wishes for 2012. So today, what we'll be doing over the next hour, and it will be in 2 parts, is I'll be sharing insights, case studies, best practice on effective crisis leadership. The information is based on my book, recent research articles, and recent blogs. And for those of you who are familiar, and there's 50% of you have experience in crisis management and 20% of you have experience in crisis communication. So today may be validation for you, it may be a refresher for you. And for those of you with experience, what I ask you to do today is to go deeper with this information. If you like, run a little self-audit for yourself and for your organization as you listen to this webinar and see the points that we are making. So you walk away with deeper understanding. And for those of you who have no experience, let's have fun on this journey. So the first part, which will be about 30 minutes or so, will be the actual webinar presentation. I'll be doing a little bit of scene setting up front, talking about what is a crisis so we're all on the same page. A little bit of context about the erosion of trust that we are all facing today, and of course the impact of the digital age. Then we'll dive deep into what makes an effective leader during a crisis. We'll look at characteristics, impressions, and there are a number of case studies. I have a roll call of good and bad to share with you. And then in particular, we're going to take a closer look at the role of the front line in a crisis, often forgotten and an incredibly important part of effective crisis management. So let's dig in. And so what is a crisis? Crisis is, and I thank veteran U.S. crisis management author consultant Jim Lukachevsky for this fantastic definition. So a crisis is a show-stopping, people-stopping, product-stopping, and indeed country-stopping event. Japan experienced that earlier this year with their tsunami, and indeed Australia has experienced that with floods and bushfires. It is when the media spotlight is firmly on you as a leader, on your brand, your organization, and most importantly, on your response. It's clearly a significant business interruption, but it is a single moment in time. That's what a crisis is. The rest is negative publicity or when we're managing hot issues. But a crisis is a single moment in time that stops the show. And so think about what might be some of the triggering events. Are there bubbling issues in your organizations that could force your organization into a crisis? Crisis management has changed forever. Why? Well, if we look at the top corner of the red dots on the screen, that will very quickly tell us about the rapid distribution of information today that leaders have to face. There is a global perspective and a local focus to every crisis today. This slide is actually shows how the information was spread via Twitter on the devastating floods in the state of Queensland and Australia earlier this year. And of course, the social media has revolutionized how crises are communicated. And it's also a reminder that information is preserved forever today. And of course, there's intense scrutiny thanks to the WikiLeaks and their partners in this world. WikiLeaks may have gone or be in financial difficulty for the moment, but the essence of what it's about will not go away. And of course, information, as we know, travels at the speed of light, but it has also spurned and enabled leaders to come to the surface, the Facebook revolution in Egypt being a prime example. Now, trust, in the middle there, held in the hands, is vital trust. Trust is being eroded today, significantly eroded across the board at a very, very low ebb. Perhaps in maybe the governments and perhaps of China, but certainly the rest of the Western world, the trust in governments and corporations is at a low, low ebb. And I actually think that the erosion of trust has led to the Occupy movements, the 1%, the 99%, the Occupy movements that we've seen spreading around the globe. And of course, down in the bottom right-hand corner, we do not forget the anonymous group. And of course, very recently, we've read about them, how they hacked into the Monsanto, the big chemical companies, a pharmaceutical company, Monsanto's PR firm, the now defunct PR firm, but nonetheless anonymous. So have a look at your organization and think about where are you vulnerable to an attack or a hacking from a group like Anonymous. So that's some of the context that I'm going to be presenting our webinar in today. Needless to say, crises are defining moments for organizations and for their leaders, for the crisis teams, anybody in a front-line, customer-facing role. Crises are defining moments. They are simply a test of character, a test of quality of the leader and the organization, a test of your values. And let's have a little quick look at the roll call here. We'll be hearing more about them as we travel down on this webinar path today. In the top left-hand corner, Anna Bligh. She is the Premier of the state of Queensland in Australia. Down in the bottom left-hand corner, the very now famous, at least here in the United States, Sully Sullenberger, who was the pilot of the miracle landing on the Hudson River in New York. In the center at the top, we have Michael McCain, the CEO of Maple Leaf. The Canadians on this call will probably recall the 2008 leadership of that crisis. In the middle is the Mayor of Christchurch in New Zealand, and he led that city's communication and efforts after their devastating earthquakes. The hapless Tony Hayward, the chief executive of the BP, who is probably the bad example sitting there at the bottom from the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico off the United States. The top right-hand corner, the media baron Rupert Murdoch. Another example we'll look at is perhaps what not to do, some ineffective crisis leadership in the wake of the phone hacking scandal in the United Kingdom earlier this year. And finally, down in the bottom right-hand corner, Rudy Giuliani, Rudy Giuliani, the mayor of New York, who led that city through its devastating 9/11 Twin Towers destruction, devastation, and disaster. Now, Ashley, we are going to move into our poll. I'd like to hear from all of you of what you think are the essential characteristics of crisis leader. And I'll leave this little slide up there for a while you think about what are the 3 essential characteristics of a crisis leader, and we'll bring your thoughts and insights and your experience into the webinar as we travel on this little journey together today. While you're thinking about that, let me just share with you some of the research and insights that I've gathered in my book and just my general working with organizations about what are the expectations of leaders today. It's this. And no surprises here probably, but let's just underline and look at some of these. I want to make my highlight work here, and yes, here we are. Perhaps doesn't want to work with me. Let me go back. Sorry about that, everybody. So take action. Let's underline that. The leaders, the effective leaders in a crisis are those who are action-oriented. They acknowledge the problems up front. They are committed to solutions. Most importantly, they are accepting responsibility. They build support. They invite help. Teamwork is critical in a crisis, and all the traits of effective crisis leaders all the research shows that teamwork is a critical part of effective leadership. They prepare for contingencies. Now let's underline there, if the only strategy is to win in the court of law, you'll fail. That is a no-no in terms of crisis leadership. Leaders can lose in the court of public opinion, more as we travel on our journey today. Most importantly, leaders need to be realistic, never ever minimize the impact, and we'll compare the BP impact versus the 9/11 impact. And most importantly of all, the community wants leaders who show and express concern for the people affected by the crisis or the disaster, and that their troubles, i.e. the affected people's trouble, matter more to the organization than that of the organization. So it's actually, if you wanted to sum that up, it's about compassion. Compassion is a critical trait of an effective crisis leader. So Ashley, do we have the results of the poll?
We do, and I'm going to project them now. They're rather interesting in light of what you just mentioned. And Jane, I'm not sure if you're able to see them, but I'll go and narrate them really quickly.
Yes, please.
The chief characteristic that folks thought was important was integrity, with 33% of people feeling that was important. Next came decisiveness, with 28% of our participants feeling that was most important. And following that was superior communication skills at 22%. The last item, compassion, came in at 6%, which is, I think, what you were just mentioning. And then authenticity was second to last. It was 11%.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you. So I'd like to be able to talk to you all about some of these, but maybe we can deal with some more in the questions. So let me go into looking at some of the characteristics that I see that are essential, and just picking up on integrity is not there, but integrity, well, indeed, it's number 3 here. The high-level integrity is actually what I describe as effective leaders in a crisis know how to be. I want to repeat that. I want you to think about what that means. Effective leaders in a crisis know how to be. And I am thankful to the legendary leader here in the United States, Frances Hesselbein, for that fantastic quote. Effective crisis leaders know how to be. Indeed, they have Churchillian, if you like, Churchill-like characteristics. Unwavering honesty. Honesty is a gigantic issue in a crisis, and I think integrity comes from being truly authentic, displaying unwavering honesty. Integrity comes from the inside, actually, and the only way that you can really get into the inside of a crisis leader and know how your leaders are going to perform in a crisis is if you actually put them under some sort of test before the crisis happens. Rudy Giuliani and the Mayor of New York City, and Anna Bligh, the Premier of Queensland, the state of the top state in Australia, when I mean top, I mean at the top end of Australia, they both were flailing, if you like, failing around, not particularly popular before, failing in the polls, weren't very popular before those particular, the Queensland floods happened, or indeed the disaster in New York on 9/11. Their true leadership came to the fore in a crisis. The inside of them came out. They knew how to be in a crisis. Let me just jump down to superior communication skills. One of, I think, the underestimated traits in a crisis leader, and particularly in a crisis when the pressure is so high, is listening skills. Listening skills. When people know how to be, they actually are present in the moment and they can listen and hear, really hear what is being said around them. They can listen and step into the shoes of the affected stakeholders. Sensitivity, demonstrating compassion, yet being impassive to drama and excitement are also key traits of leaders. You know, we talked about decisiveness. It was number 2 in the poll. You know, the results of the investigation into the oil spill actually identified a number of leadership traits when they looked at the performance, the good performance, stellar performance of Admiral Allen from the US Coast Guard. He took charge of the BP oil spill. He was a stellar example of effective leadership. He had command of presence. He was authoritative. He had enhanced leadership skills, and which were able to transcend the pressures of a crisis, and he was able to use those traits throughout the duration of the event. Skills such as multitasking, organizational development, analytical and communication skills, listening. Listening was a very important trait of Admiral Allen in the BP oil spill. Obviously, the ability to delegate, again, very important in crisis leaders, and also the ability to leverage organizational flexibility is vital. And at some of the higher levels of crisis management, it's actually important that leaders understand and can function within the political environment. And I think one of the most important traits, apart from knowing how to be and being team builders, and obviously having stamina and steadiness, is the ability to be able to communicate the end game. Good, effective, decisive, and effective crisis leaders can assess risk, can know how to minimize the risk, but they actually know what success looks like, and they know the end game, and they're able to communicate the end game. And they have the ability to inspire and motivate. So the bottom line is that effective leaders fundamentally understand the motivation of others and understand how to step into the shoes of the affected audience. They know how to pick the panic and to be able to communicate that effectively. Here's a concept that one of the thoughts I want to leave you with today, and we'll talk a little bit about this a couple of times. It's a principle I talk about in depth in my book, and it's the head and the heart principle. The head is the rational decision making, but it's the heart that gives us the ability to be. The head and the heart must come together in a crisis. We must and be able to demonstrate we know how to be. We can get into our heart space. And all crisis leaders, all good crisis leaders demonstrate this. And speaking of the head and the heart, I want you all to fall in love with we, with the word we. And notice I'm going to look a little bit more closely here at Bob Parker, the Mayor of Christchurch in New Zealand, and his performance in the earthquake devastation there, and Anna Bligh, the Premier of Queensland, with the devastating floods. We. It is about we, because a crisis is not just about you. A crisis involves other people, other affected stakeholders. Bob Parker, widely praised for his leadership during the devastating earthquakes in New Zealand, says this: together we will survive. Churchillian-like, don't you think? His words were calming. This is what the researcher said. His words were calming. He brought a beacon of hope and reassurance. Again, effective crisis leaders do this. Anna Bligh had appropriate sensitivity. She became one of us, one of the Queenslanders. And let me read just so that we're all conscious. Look at the we's here. No I's, but we. We are Queenslanders, she says. We're the people they breed tough north of the border. She's stepping into the shoes of the Queenslanders. She's motivating them and inspiring them because she's going to be asking them to do things. So we're Queenslanders, she said. We're the people they breed tough north of the border. We're the ones that they knock down and we get up again. It might be breaking our hearts, but it will not break our will. Again, echoes of Churchill. The Churchillian resolve is how she was described during that crisis. So let's delve a little bit more into why some leaders shine and others fail. Let's have a look at Rudy Giuliani, and we'll compare some of his leadership performance in that crisis on 9/11 with the hapless Tony Hayward of BP and the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico off the United States of America. Unconditional honesty from the start was a characteristic of Rudy Giuliani's leadership during that dreadful time in New York City a few years ago. Sparse words. The number of casualties, he said, will be more than any of us can bear ultimately. And if we compare, and that's a concept, that's not a specific words, but he's basically saying at a high picture level, of course it'll be more than any of us can bear. Even if it was one life, it would be more than any of us can bear, as opposed to 1,000 lives. So it's actually very, very smart, as opposed to Tony Hayward and BP obfuscating, if you like, the truth, and they kept changing their numbers, which basically equates to a lack of trust. And a trusted voice is an effective crisis leader. So if you keep changing your mind and there's inconsistency, there's most likely you're going to fail, or there'll be a lack of trust. So the Gulf of Mexico is a very big ocean. Tony Hayward was quoted as in the Daily Mail. The volume of oil and dispersant we're putting into it is tiny in relation to the total water volume. Well, that might be factually correct, but I'm not sure about you. But what was the impression it created? Not caring, really, perhaps, as opposed to Rudy Giuliani, who had excellent communication skills, again, sparse. He demonstrated that you must speak up and take charge, and I just want to repeat this, you must speak up and take charge of what people are thinking and saying. Good crisis leaders can step into the shoes of their constituencies and speak the words that they want to hear, as opposed to sugarcoating and blaming The blame game is a deadly sin for any crisis leader, for any crisis communication, any crisis management response. The blame game was played out very early. And let's look at the negative language. Negative language is toxic in a crisis. Good crisis leaders speak in action terms. They talk about what is and what they're doing, not about what they're not doing. So let's hear the blame game. This was not our accident. Really? Whose accident was it? This was not our drilling rig. This was Transocean's rig, their systems, their people, their equipment. Sugarcoating is a no-no. Blame, negative language, deadly sins. Body language. Impressions. I'm very big on impressions management because in this day, which is highly visual thanks to YouTube and a YouTube video and smartphones, and vision can be around the world in a matter of seconds, and it's only going to increase with the number of smartphones and the trends to mobile applications. You look at Rupert Murdoch's face there. What is the impression that he gives? And this, I might add, is when he was speaking at the parliamentary inquiry of the phone hacking scandal in the UK, where there were plenty of victims. Rupert Murdoch is talking about it was his humble day. Well, that is not a we. That isn't stepping into the shoes of the affected constituents. My question to you, Mr. Murdoch, would have been, it's all, where's your heart? What about the victims? Just remember that today we are dealing with a visual medium. The majority of the communication today will either be visual or vocal, and we will make a decision in a nanosecond, a blink of an eye, whether we're going to believe you or not. Authenticity, transparency equals integrity equals trust. And here's a concept I want to just leave you with, that leaders default to type in a crisis. Leaders default to type in a crisis. You want to make sure you know what leadership type you have before a crisis hits. Values are on display in a crisis. There is no doubt that crises show an organization's true colors, a leader's true colors. A crisis is a test of the leader's character, a company's value and culture. You want to make sure that your leaders in a crisis mesh with the organizational values. Do they? Does your leader, when he or she communicates, are they communicating your values, or are they against your values? So let's dive in here and have a look closer at the Canadian, and to all the Canadians out there will remember the gold standard, Michael McCain, the CEO of Maple Leaf, who back in 2008 recalled, some of them voluntary, but ultimately recalled all their products and shut down a plant because of a listeria outbreak, which caused deaths. Okay, so some human error involved here. Both of these are actually some human error as opposed to the devastation of Mother Nature with earthquakes and floods. These are human error. Potentially, one could argue, could have been avoided. So let's look at the words here. And I'll then share with you what the media response was. Tragically, and this is again, I just want to highlight here, it's very important for crisis leader to characterize the crisis. How does the organization characterize the crisis? Is it a tragedy? Is this devastating? Are we sad? Are we regretful? And then if you are, you must stick to the consistency of those words. So, tragically, our products have been linked to illness and loss of life. To those people who are ill and to the families who have lost loved ones, I offer my deepest and sincerest sympathies. When I can read that, but when you hear it or see it in particular, the head and the heart must come together. The head knows that we must apologize in a crisis, but it only means something if the heart is engaged. And your crisis leader is present, knows how to be. The media response, CBC News, and I'll quote here, said that the organisation was highly praised for its communication efforts. They have been highly visible, and so the openness of Maple Leaf and their actions gained the attention of the media in a very positive way. Now let's compare that to Tony Hayward and BP. Again, he starts off with an apology, and yes, it is a we. We're sorry for the massive disruptions it's caused their lives, really. That puts us, I think, by saying their lives, it's an us versus them, or us versus us, you know, us versus them concept, and I think that's a bad thing in a crisis. So I would have changed those words around. There's no one who wants this over more than I do. Echoes of Rupert Murdoch. I would like my life back. Now that quote is going to haunt Tony Hayward and BP forever as how not to do it, if you like, the black standard. The media response to that, let me quote you, the Guardian newspaper in the UK. BP has unwittingly adopted responsibility as opposed to the gold standard of Maple Leaf in Canada in 2008 that took the responsibility for the listeria outbreaks immediately and took action steps to repair. BP vacillated and got their communication wrong. So I would argue that superior communication skills were missing overall in the BP leadership during the Gulf of Mexico crisis. Let's get back to the heart and the head for a minute. So what have we learned so far? In your own, for those of you with deeper experience, what have you been refreshed on? What have you learned in your own self-assessment? What is the head-heart ratio in your organization? Have your leaders fallen in love with we? Can you encourage them to fall in love with we? Or is it I, all about me, all about our organization? What is the level of understanding of the heart as opposed to the knowledge from the head? I'm pausing. Maybe you want to make a note or two and we can talk more in the questions. So now let's dive in and look at the front line. The customer-facing role, very simply, your front line are your ambassadors. We all know this, we all read this, it's been in the research. But how many organizations truly understand the power of the front line in a crisis? Okay, who are the front line leaders? They are your lab assistants. They are your lecturers for the university and the academics on this call. They are your technical experts. They are your boat captains. They are your security guards. They are your call centers. They are your receptionists. They are your volunteers. They are the factory workers. They are the night watchmen. They are the supervisors. They are your ambassadors. Anybody in a customer-facing role that can be asked a question in a grocery line is vulnerable in a crisis unless you educate and empower your front line. You can't fight a war with just generals and admirals. You need can-do, empowered employees on the front line. The front line might be social media today. It might be how you tweet, the tone of how you tweet, how you empower or give guidelines to your employees, your volunteers, your supporters, your advocates. They're all your front line. The flanks need to be prepared, drilled, and on message will help protect your business in a crisis. Again, what will they say in the grocery line? What will they say at the soccer match? What will they say at the basketball match? Everybody knows who you're all working for. What will they be saying? Effective crisis leaders know how to motivate and inspire. Teamwork is critical in a crisis. Often the front line are closer to the action. They might know more. They might have an example of a can-do story that the chief executive or your leader can speak about when they give a press conference or have to make a statement to the affected stakeholders. And the research shows us that 8 out of 10 CEOs rely on people in a crisis, not so much as a plan. So your employees, your volunteers, they actually want to be involved. Ask them how. CEOs are not necessarily the best spokespeople. Think about Tony Hayward. Where can you go if the CEO stuffs up? Excuse me, but and they need technical support. Yes, we need consistency of spokespeople in a crisis, but let's make sure that the consistency is kept to the leader and the support, and you rotate those around. And quite frankly, in the digital age, we're seeing a move away from the command and control, the traditional way of doing crisis management, to more of enablement and empowerment. If you like, the social media has revolutionized this, and it's certainly for Cisco, the big US-based technology company, Cisco Networks. Their motto today is everyone's a spokesperson, and they plan their communication and their policies around that philosophy. Very powerful, I think. Okay. So, what to do with the front line? The overall philosophy here is empower and educate. Censorship is not the answer. Guidelines and open communication are. You can't gag employees in the grocery line or at the cricket match or at the basketball match or at the soccer match. So what do? Train the frontline in basic media awareness. Involve them in desktops and brainstorming exercises. The new way today is to have cross-functional interdisciplinary teams, bring together marketing, legal, PR, HR, any of the customer-facing roles, and encourage teamwork and encourage that framework and culture in your organizations. Involve employees in your trust bank efforts. The research shows that monetary incentives only work for very menial tasks. Purpose is what motivates people. Having autonomy, mastery, and purpose motivate people. So what can we learn from these three organizations? They're all here in North America. Best Buy is a large retail chain selling various bits of technology, computers, televisions, smartphones. What they do is that they media train all their sales associates. Can you imagine what an asset that will be in a crisis? They also have a chief context officer, and context is really important in a crisis. We all need context. We all need a way of thinking about a crisis, and good, effective crisis leaders know about context. US Army, very conservative organization, but they've empowered their front line. Yes, they've always been able to do that in battle, as it were, but in terms of common sense guidelines for social media at the front line, they have basically trust their front line in social media. And the US Coast Guard, I mention again because they media train their front line so that all their spokespeople, if you like, are singing from the same hymn book. Their policy and motto flows through everything they do, which is maximum disclosure, minimum delay. Maximum disclosure, minimum delay. So, time to step back, and I'm going to be finishing up my part of the presentation soon, so you will deal with your questions. But let me just do a little your self-assessment checklist here. How are you going? Let's think about these are what not to do. Are you in love yet? Have you thought about how the use of the word we and compassion and integrity? Be silent when answers are needed is a no-no. BP comes to mind. Start a blaming game. Deadly sin for crisis leaders. Banning dissenters or censoring. That's when people want to take down bad YouTube videos. Sometimes it's necessary, but not always. Or take down bad posts on Facebook. Sometimes necessary, but not always. If you censor, you'll get censorship back. Insult your customers. Tone only begets tone. If you're angry, be appropriately angry, not angry at what people have done, but share their anger, share their pain. Before we get to the questions, I like these 10 crisis management 10 commandments, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of these. Number 2, you should tell it all, tell it fast, and tell it honestly. Direct communication and unwavering honesty from the beginning. Think 9/11, Rudy Giuliani versus BP that changed their numbers, that changed their mind, and there was no consistency. Tell it all, tell it fast, and tell it honestly. You should stare the devil down and be brave. It takes courage in a crisis because you need to know the end game and you need to be able to communicate that effectively and consistently. 7, you shall practice and train, you shall like it. Yes, we all know that we must drill and exercise and train annually, at least annually, and cross-functional teams, please. You shall demonstrate compassion. Let's add to that. Demonstrate sensitivity, and you shall practice head and heart communication. And just one final thought before we get to our questions. This I wanted to share from a Nestle executive talking about a crisis at a business school lecture a few years ago. Let's look at the second line here. Overcome a natural aloofness and protectiveness. As human beings, we want to protect, but in fact, we need to do the opposite in a crisis. We need to learn how to be and be present for others. Become aware of the concerns of others. Reach out in a crisis. Reach out. And final thoughts, and I'm indebted to Scott Monty, the social media guru at the Ford Motor Company, for the first one, and I hope all of our colleagues from Europe and Asia are familiar with Las Vegas. I'm sure the movies out there will probably give you a bit of a feeling of what happens in Vegas, sometimes things that we may wish never to be shared with anybody else at the casinos. Anyway, so what happens in Vegas stays on the Google. Stays on Lord Google, as they say. And that's a reminder from the very beginning when I said that information is preserved forever. Information is preserved forever. As Mark Zuckerberg's girlfriend at the very beginning of the movie, The Social Network, if you haven't seen it, borrow it and have a look at it. The internet is written in ink, not pencil, Mark. So, questions?
Yes.
Do we have any there, Ashley?
Yes, we do. Thank you so much, Jane, for a great presentation so far. Questions are rolling in, and those of you who have not asked questions, if you'd like to, you can use the questions box in your webinar control panel. I'd like to stretch back to the beginning of your presentation, more or less. We've got a question from Hadassah, who is writing in from the United States, Florida. And she is asking, communities expect such wonderful qualities from leaders, but there are times that due to unexpected circumstances, leaders are forced to improvise, causing them to break rules that might affect their style of leadership. Do you observe this also? Does this seem to happen in your work, and do you have any thoughts on that?
You know, sometimes breaking rules is what it takes to get the job done. But most crises are actually things that we can anticipate. And I think if we break the rules, we need to break it with sensitivity and compassion. Whatever we do in a crisis, the most effective leaders are always ones that lead with the thinking about the impact on the stakeholders, the people who've been affected by the crisis. If you step into their shoes with sensitivity, you are going to always be on the front foot. It's incredibly important to think about in a crisis, what are the overall impressions we want to create? What are the overall impressions we want to create? Given this situation, given the values of our organization, if we're a stiff, upper-lipped sort of organization, well, that's the way we're going to behave. But be true to your values is what I would say in response to that question. And always remember that you need to step into the shoes of the affected people.
Good. That's a great response. And I've got a couple other questions along that same line, stepping into the shoes of the affected people. First, Tony Hayward, of course, is a great exemplar, I guess, of a lot of things that we're talking about. And we've got a question about that. Referring to Tony Hayward's "I would like my life back, that will of course haunt him forever, but seen out of context, one could almost read into that exclamation an attempt at humanity. Do you think he was trying to sympathize with the common person, link himself to the constituents experiencing this, or was it just a complete, utter mistake?
I think it was a complete and utter mistake, but I do think, I mean, let me just say I can only give my observations based on what I've read and the conversations that I've had with peers in my industry. I was not, I have to say here, I was not in the room at the time giving advice. I think I think this is a bit of a myth about crisis leadership, is that people can think they're stepping into the shoes of the stakeholders by saying, as a father, I can feel your pain. Well, really? It's a bit like Rupert Murdoch saying, this is the most humble day of my life. I actually want to know that you care about me. And unless you're very sincere and you can demonstrate compassion and integrity by saying, I'm a father, I think overall that comes across, it misfires. So I think at whatever level that Tony Hayward, wherever he was coming from, and let's assume that he was coming from a place of, from his heart, it misfired and backfired because it was very, I think, more ego-driven than it was driven thinking about the stakeholders.
Yeah, and I guess reflecting on what you said earlier, maybe too much focus on I and not enough focus on we. But that's a great analysis. Parroting off of that, we've got a question. One of our participants is asking, are there ways that you can teach or learn the ability to put yourself in the constituent's position, or maybe exercises that you can do?
Absolutely fantastic question, thank you. Yes, there is. Now, there's a couple of things I want to say to that. Very good training, very good media training with with very highly experienced coaches and trainers is a very good thing to do. Literally, when if you're practicing, is to practice in front of other people and have them critique and say, this is the impression you're creating. It's very, very important to rehearse and practice and test. That's my point about doing annual tests and drills and exercise. And the other thing I just want to throw in here, that all effective leaders, in my experience, have had a coach or a mentor along the way. If you read any of the biographies of any of the big leaders that we would want to put up on the pedestal, they all had coaches. For example, Rudy Giuliani had a coach. He actually sought the advice and sat down with, in the early hours and the early stages of the 9/11 crisis. He had a psychologist working with him, and they sat at somebody he had never met before, very interestingly, but obviously somebody who came highly recommended and highly trusted. And so he was able to tap into that experience of a very good psychologist who really understood human behavior and went with his instincts. So leaders, good leaders, effective leaders are always looking to learn, and they do have coaches and mentors. So again, my advice to anybody out there with no experience yet, find yourself a very good mentor and coach, and find any way that you can practice your communication skills, because superior communication skills are the make it or break it in a crisis. So find a coach and a mentor, and practice and get some good solid media training.
Great. Okay, thank you, Jane. Another question from Hadassah, and they're asking, how does integrity relate to resilience? Or does it relate to resilience?
I think those are two different traits, actually. Resilience, to me, is more to do with stamina, and the ability to be able to handle the stress and the highly emotional stages of crisis management.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the key traits that was identified in the incident-specific performance review, a mouthful, but the incident-specific performance review that was done in the wake of the 9/11, in the wake of the Gulf spill on crisis leadership, talked about stress management and the ability to function during periods of extreme stress. A crisis will certainly bring about high levels of stress during critical periods, and effective crisis leaders have stamina. They are resilient. You know, because if we've got a good trusted face like a Giuliani or an Admiral Allen like we had with the Coast Guard during the oil spill, we actually want to see them. There is a public expectation in a crisis of seeing one face and hearing one voice, as long as that is a good face and a good voice, that is. So crisis at the highest levels should be prepared to manage from mobilization through to demobilization phases of the response. Integrity comes from the inside. It's part of the heart response in a crisis. It's part of being. You either have integrity or you don't when it comes down to the end of the day, I think.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And you had mentioned in your presentation the phrase trust bank. Can you clarify what you meant by that or go into some more detail there?
Oh, great. Thanks for that great question. So trust bank, let me give you a quick example. It's a North American example, but it speaks to what I mean about the trust bank. In a crisis, you need to make withdrawals from your bank, as it were, your trust bank. But that in a crisis you need a very, very large trust balance in there. So back in the 1980s, there were, in the wake of the Rodney King shooting, there was racial riots in America and Los Angeles. And many fast food stores were looted. And there was only one really that was left standing, and it became a story in its own right. And that fast food outlet that was untouched in those riots was McDonald's. Why? Because McDonald's had a long-standing culture of reaching out to the Black African American community and having franchisees that were part of the community. And so the media were very curious about why McDonald's was left standing, and they asked, some of the rioters and the looters, why McDonald's was still standing. And the response from the community was, they're one of us. They're one of us. So that McDonald's had built a community outreach. There was dollars in the trust bank in spades. So they were able to draw on that significant goodwill and basically were left standing in a crisis. So building your dollars in your trust bank, and this is one way you can empower your front line. For example, let's go back to Best Buy. Best Buy, the North American retail chain, their sales associates who are media trained, these are the literally young kids on the floor in the Best Buy retail outlets. They go onto national television and talk about the products and the gadgets with enthusiasm and knowledge. And that's sort of building a bit of the trust bank. Put the volunteers, your lecturers, all of your front line can be empowered and, if you like, be out in the community and serving, building however you can build your trust bank, build your trust bank.
That's great. Okay, thank you, Jane. I think we have time for one more question. The next question, it's a bit of a mouthful, but I like where it's going, and I hope you will also. The question is, what practice do you most recommend for striking the crucial balance between authentic presence and engagement and self-sustainment and renewal for the leaders in an organization, especially in the name of readiness to respond to a crisis? And my take on that, I think that where this person's going is they're wondering, what you can do to be ready for these moments and to be renewed so that, when you're called to it, you can be authentic and you're not, I guess, overly withdrawn by the time that a crisis comes up.
It's a really interesting question, and are we ever really ready? Well, I think Giuliani and Anna Bligh were probably never been ready for the devastation of those floods, or indeed the Twin Towers. But what they had was an innate ability to be able to step into their finest hour, to be Churchill-like. And it is about learning to be present in the moment. And one of the ways that I've learned how to be present in the moment, and I think it's an ongoing learning tool for all of us really, is I do yoga, I meditate. Whatever one can do to draw on those skills, to be silent, literally to be silent, to move out of chaos and take 2 or 3 minutes and center oneself. Now, some research from Harvard Business School and Stanford here in the United States of America shows that one way you can get a commanding presence is to stand for 2 minutes with your arms outstretched. So if anybody wants to stand up, I'm standing up at my desk right now and my arm is stretched up high and I've got my eyes closed and I'm just concentrating on my inner being. And if you do that for full 2 minutes, you will be centered and you will be in command. That's what the research shows us, but it must be 2 minutes. So whatever you can do to put yourself into that, into your heart space, as I call it, to connect with the inner being, 2 minutes standing up with your arms outstretched it's a simple little tool, an effective tool, and research from some august bodies here in the United States shows that it works.
Well, I'm going to put that into practice right after the webinar. Thank you, Jane. At this time, I'd like to bring a close to the questions. Thank you, Jane, so much for taking the time to be with us today and for offering such a wonderful presentation. I'd like to now announce the winners of the book giveaway. 4 of today's participants were randomly selected to receive a copy of Jane Jordan-Meier's latest book. They are Martin F. from Australia, Teresa L. from Portugal, Joe T. from New York, and Paul L. from Ohio here in the United States. Congratulations to those winners. To everyone, I hope you enjoyed today's webinar, and if you did, I hope you'll also be able to join us for future installments of ILA's Leadership Perspectives webinar series. You can visit www.ila-net.org for more details on those future installments. Thank you once again to everyone today for joining us. I hope you all continue to be well and to do good work. Take care.